Avengers Infinity War is breaking a seemingly infinite number of box office records, and deservedly so. It stands as a testament to a decade-long experiment that others have tried to clone, replicate, or rip off, all with little to no success. Infinity War is the current crowning jewel of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, a film franchise that has released an average of 2 movies a year for 10 years, and somehow turned genre fatigue into the largest opening box office takings of all time. My name's Dominic Archer, and I'm a comic book writer and academic with a master's in comics and graphic novels and a bachelor's in screenwriting. And with the help of some colleagues, friends, and fans of the series, I'll be dissecting the MCU movie by movie to see what Marvel did right, where they slipped up along the way, and how it is that the heroes nobody wanted have become cultural icons for the 21st century. Before jumping into the series that came to redefine the superhero genre, it's worth defining what the superhero genre actually is, and how it got to where it is today. At first that question seems so simple you wonder why it needs to be asked at all, like everyone knows what a superhero is, right? It's a man in tights with some kind of special ability, who fights for truth, justice, and more often not the American way. Now while that may be an oversimplification of the first superhero, the genre itself has diversified to such an extent since Superman's debut in 1938 that multiple theorists continue to debate it. For the sake of argument, we'll be taking Dr. Peter Coogan's definition of the superhero, which requires 3 main character elements. A pro-social mission that looks to better the community in which the superhero surrounds themselves. Powers or abilities that separate them from the very community that they are trying to help, and an identity that they are trying to reflect through their superheroics, as well as a separate one they use in order to operate in the normal human world. While many of these character elements existed before the emergence of the superhero, within characters such as the Phantom and Zorro, it was not until the arrival of Superman that these tropes came together to form genre conventions that later writers and artists would use as molds for their own storytelling. The 1940s saw an explosion of colourful and exciting new characters, almost all of whom were based on the conventions established by the Man of Steel. World War II saw the conscription of these widely popular figures as forms of propaganda, most relevantly for our discussions in the form of Joe Simon and Jack Kirby's Captain America, whose debut comic famously depicted the hero socking old Adolf Hitler in the jaw. And it's worth pointing out that from the very beginning, the superhero genre existed across multiple medias. The Adventures of Superman radio show first aired in 1940, just 2 years after the character's introduction, and will continue to see out the decade, highlighting the instant success and widespread acclaim that these new characters possessed. And the radio show was not just an adaptation of pre-existing stories either. In fact, it's credited with the phrase, "It's a bird, it's a plane," and the very concept of kryptonite, a plot device needed to give Superman's voice actor Bud Collyer a well-deserved vacation. And that's not all. The Fleischer Studios Superman cartoons from the early 1940s saw the introduction of Superman's ability to fly, as this was easier to animate than repeatedly leaping tall buildings in a single bound. But with the end of the Second World War came a new America, and a new comic book industry that focused more on teenage horror and romance stories than it did on aliens wearing red and blue spandex suits. This could very well have been the end of the superhero genre, as it faded into obscurity behind the rise of flesh-eating zombies and girls who just wanted to know why that boy doesn't love her. Had it not been for a psychologist named Frederick Wortham. Now, I'm not going to have time to go into great depth about everything that Wortham said or did, but if you can imagine a time in which McCarthyism is dominating popular culture, combined with the parents' need to blame anyone but themselves for their child's issues, then you're starting to get the idea. Wortham brought a multitude of horror and romance comics before a Senate committee, and by taking these books wildly out of context was able to gain publicity, by saying that these would drive decent, God-fearing children into the kinds of teenagers who wore leather jackets and listened to rock and or roll. Fearing that this could be the end of the industry itself, the largest mainstream companies formed a self-regulatory commission known as the Comics Code Authority, which set certain rules about what could and couldn't be depicted in the pages of comic books. To publishers like EC Comics, the code was a death sentence, banning the use or mention of various supernatural monsters to such an extent that writer Marv Wolfman found his work rejected by the authority as his name contained the phrase Wolfman. For industry veterans and creative visionaries like Stan Lee and Jack Kirby, however, the comic book medium must have seemed like a jigsaw puzzle, with all the pieces laid scattered in front of them just begging to be put together. And that's not to say that DC Comics wasn't producing valuable material at the time. The 1950s era of golden age superhero stories introduced many of the most recognizable characters and storytelling motifs that would feature going forward. But it was in 1961 that Marvel Comics changed the superhero genre forever. Question: if you're not allowed to depict the terrifying transformation of man to werewolf, but you have a young audience thirsting for body horror stories, then how do you satisfy that demand without breaking the Comics Code Authority? And what about the stories that deal with the burgeoning issues of civil rights in America? How can you address them without risking the ire of those who seek to prevent change? What about children themselves? Young people have always made up the readership of comic books, and yet only get to see themselves depicted as heartbroken teens, or fodder to be eaten alive by ghoulish creatures. Surely there could be something more relatable than that. Surely there could be something more amazing, more spectacular than that. In November of 1961, the same year that Soviet pilot Yuri Gagarin became the first man to orbit the Earth, and just 6 months after President John F. Kennedy announced the US will reach the moon before the decade is out, a team of genius American patriots came together with the express purpose of defeating the Red Menace. Unwilling to let communists take all the glory, these astronauts designed and tested an experimental spacecraft that unwittingly exposed them to dangerous cosmic rays. Upon losing control of the ship and crashing back to Earth, all 4 members of the crew began to experience something strange, something fantastic. Dr. Reed Richards finds that his body can stretch like an elastic band. His possible love interest, Susan Storm, finds that she can turn completely invisible to the eye. Susan's brother, Johnny Storm, can set his whole body aflame on command. And Reed's best friend, the street-smart Brooklyn boy, Ben Grimm, watches as his human form begins to be replaced with some kind of orange rock, leaving him no more a man than a thing. The story goes that Marvel publisher Marvin Goodman was playing golf with the head of what would become DC Comics, and all they talked about was the success of DC's new superhero team called the Justice League of America. Now, as a man who built his career riding the waves of populism, Goodman returned to his comics editor Stan Lee and instructed that Marvel create a superhero team of their own. While the specifics of this story are debated, Goodman's demanding nature is well recorded. In fact, at this point, Stan Lee himself has said that his career seemed to have lost any kind of meaning. He was depressed, having never written the great American novel he had always dreamed about. At this point, he'd been working with Goodman for over 22 years, making his writing debut on Captain America issue number 3 in 1941, and he was made interim editor the same year. For the next 2 decades, Lee oversaw comics ranging from romance to western to science fiction to the kind of horror stories that soon found themselves banned by the Comics Code Authority, but none of these things ever stuck. They were merely trends that would rise and fall with popular demand. No one would ever remember the teen exploits of young Patsy Walker. Stories featuring the Norse god Thor faded into obscurity, and hell, even the great Captain America had been cancelled after sales began to slump in the early 1950s. For Lee, a long career in comics seemed to be coming to an end, and revisiting the superhero genre hardly seemed like the path to immortal recognition that he was seeking. It's at this point that Lee credits his wife Joan for what would become the new wave of comic book superheroes. When things were at their darkest, when our hero was at his breaking point, Joan came to him and said, "Why don't you write one comic you'd be proud of?" Now, Jack Kirby tells a very different version of events in which Lee, on the verge of a nervous breakdown, went to the artist, complaining that Marvel was finished and begging for help. Kirby claims that he stepped in to save the company and that revitalizing the entire superhero genre was merely a fortunate byproduct. Undoubtedly, there are elements of truth in both of these stories, as neither one of the creators could have achieved what they did without the other. The debut of the Fantastic Four set the tone for the new era of superhero comics. These characters didn't just have powers, but they were also a family that would bicker and fight amongst themselves as much as they would the villains. Their matching blue uniforms adorned with the number 4 create a sense of team unity, while each member's unique designs highlights the power of the individual. The team is not complete if one member is missing, but even on their own, you immediately understand that they are a force to be reckoned with. Kirby and Lee would use this recipe again in 1963's Uncanny X-Men issue number 1, and it was clear by this point that the pair had managed to put the pieces of the puzzle together. By combining the super with the emotion-filled storylines popular in romance comics and fusing those with social commentary and the trends the Goodman was so keen on following, Marvel was able to create icon after icon. Still looking for that werewolf body horror story? How about a man that transforms into a monster of incredible strength after being hit with the gamma bomb when you actually liked Patsy Walker romance stories? Well, don't worry, we'll give her a cameo in the Fantastic Four to show she's still here, and hell, why don't we make her a superhero too? What's that? You're really into psychedelic evaluations of the metaphysical? Well, why don't you just drop some acid and take a look at Steve Ditko's art for the Sorcerer Supreme Doctor Strange? Silver Surfer, Doctor Doom, Magneto, Black Panther, Daredevil, Ant-Man, Iron Man, even Captain America has been taken off ice. Lee, Kirby and others too numerous to mention were creating a legacy that would see out the century and become even more popular in the next. But in the terms of cultural penetration, in terms of the iconography that can even rival Superman's, in terms of a character so relatable that you identify with so strongly he just has to marry a supermodel, there can only be one. A teenager from Queens who discovers that with great power comes great responsibility, Peter Parker must balance his sense of right and wrong with his need to help his ailing aunt, to hang out with his friends, and God, just to try and finish his homework. What's perhaps most important about this character is that he's working class. This isn't the Fantastic Four with their own skyscraper in Manhattan. It isn't millionaire playboy Bruce Wayne or Tony Stark. And yeah, Superman grew up on a Kansas farm, but he's so strong he can punch the multiverse. That destroys any hopes of being a relatable character, right? But for Peter, his choices have real-world consequences. If he rushes away from his part-time job to save someone's life, Aunt May might not have the money to pay the electricity bill. It's said that the X-Men have become an allegory for LGBT rights as characters discover more about their identity when they hit puberty, but for the X-Men they do this together as a family and as a community. Spider-Man undergoes a similar transformation completely on his own. This is a boy whose body is undergoing incredible change, trapped between childhood and becoming the adult that both his aunt and society need him to be, while the only role model he ever had to lead him to manhood was just shot on the street, and it was Peter's fault. The amount of responsibility on this child's shoulders is insurmountable, as best displayed in Amazing Spider-Man 33, where he's literally trapped under rubble. The universal appeal of this character doesn't come from the circumstances in which he finds himself, but from his sheer determination to do what is right. He doesn't lift the rubble to save himself. He doesn't break free to avenge his family's death. He does it because Aunt May needs him, and he can't let her down again. And yet somehow, it's fun. This era of Marvel introduced heroes with faults. It gave readers action-packed stories with comedy and enough humanity to make it feel like these characters are more than fiction. They're your friends. This sense of camaraderie was a highly crafted art form that was mastered by Lee, who looked to engage the reader by forming a second level of fiction, the Marvel bullpen. Perhaps best compared to the fictional world of WWE wrestling, in which you're expected to believe that what you see is genuine relationships playing out before your eyes, rather than some kind of staged performance. The Marvel bullpen was an imagined world in which various Marvel creators existed as best buddies who looked forward to bringing you yet another adventure from your favourite hero. The reality was quite different, with long periods of time in which artists would fall out with editorial over plot points or story credits, but the illusion of larger-than-life figures like Stan the Man and King Kirby created brand loyalty. You weren't just a Spider-Man fan, you were a Marvel fan. And with the current culture of celebrity CEOs like Bill Gates or Steve Jobs, this may not seem particularly innovative. But how many comic book creators can the average cinema goer recognize? Can they recognize the editor-in-chief for DC Comics from the same period? Do they even know their name? It's unlikely, but I can almost guarantee that where Stan Lee makes his inevitable cameo, everyone recognizes the slick back hair, the thick glasses, and God, that beautiful mustache. By 1967, both Spider-Man and the Fantastic Four had their own animated series, and after Lee stopped writing full-time in 1972, he began to focus more heavily on getting Marvel characters into other mediums. Live-action television adaptations of Spider-Man were made in both America and Japan. And of course, Mr. Universe himself, Lou Ferrigno, starred in 83 episodes of The Incredible Hulk. All of these achievements seemed paltry in comparison to those of DC Comics after 1978's Superman, starring Christopher Reeve, Gene Hackman, and Marlon Brando. Superman became Warner Brothers' most successful film of all time and was premiered in London in the presence of Queen Elizabeth herself. Meanwhile, Marvel's big screen release the same year was an amalgamation of 2 episodes of the low-budget Spider-Man TV series to be shown in European territories. After Superman 2 came out in 1980 and the success of Star Wars comics saved Marvel from bankruptcy, Stan Lee decided to move to Hollywood in 1981 and focus on promoting Marvel through its properties and his own celebrity. But despite, or perhaps because of Lee's hard work, the first cinematic release of Marvel characters was disastrous. Lucasfilm's adaptation of Steve Gerber's satire Howard the Duck was a critical and box office failure that ruined the reputation of a character who had been carefully structured to critique American society. Instead, it won 7 Golden Raspberry Awards. 1989's The Punisher, starring chemical engineer Dolph Lundgren, has never released theatrically in America, instead just being shown in Germany and France. And 1990's Captain America, well, I just can't watch a trailer of. I can't. Then there's the low-budget Roger Corman-produced Fantastic Four movie that many people in Marvel didn't even know was being made. Marvel executive Avi Arad is famed for purchasing the rights to the film once it had been made, and then ordering all prints in existence destroyed before it could be released in case it damaged the franchise. While on television, the X-Men animated series had received critical and commercial acclaim, having adapted Chris Claremont's storylines from the 1980s, it was not until 1998 that the first successful Marvel movie made its way into cinemas. Wesley Snipes stars as Blade, a vampire hunter with all the abilities of a vampire, but none of their weaknesses. The 90s themselves had been full of adaptations for DC characters. Tim Burton's Batman series had risen to prominence, and then destruction at the hands of Joel Schumacher. But in terms of Marvel characters, Blade was the first to have any kind of presence on the silver screen. For Hollywood companies that had been soured by the release of Batman and Robin, Blade would be a litmus test for the success of future superhero films. What's interesting about Blade is whether or not it should actually be classified as a superhero movie at all. Going back to our earlier definition of what a superhero is, Blade exists outside the realm of normal superheroes. He doesn't try to prevent crime, nor does he have some kind of secret identity which he hides to protect the ones he loves. The only thing that makes him a superhero are his superpowers, but these powers come from the genre fiction world in which he is encased. Blade is a character born out of vampire fiction. His status as anything more than a vampire hunter relies upon the world in which he is based. The superhero Blade can be regarded as such because he lives in a world with other superheroes. If he's fighting alongside the likes of Spider-Man, as seen in the Spider-Man animated series episode titled Blade, then he is by his nature a superhero. But if he exists outside the world of web swingers and Iron Men, then the success of the story can be found in the popularity of vampire fiction rather than that of the superhero. And this argument could be made for characters such as Thor, who reflect the realms of fantasy and mythology more than they do of Superman, but who are given legitimacy by the environment in which they interact. This can be seen within the Blade trilogy, which embraces its comic book heritage increasingly as the series goes on, much to its detriment. The more of the stereotyped ideals of the superhero that it tries to include, the further away it gets from the creative vision of the source material. But off the back of the original Blade movie came an opening of the Marvel floodgates. From the years 2000 to 2007, there were 3 X-Men movies released, 3 Spider-Man movies released, 2 more Blade movies released, a Daredevil movie, a Punisher movie, a Hulk movie, an Elektra movie, a Ghost Rider movie, and 2 Fantastic Four movies, all of which were received with varying degrees of success. Now, the quality of these films is not as important to this conversation as their commercial performances. While each one of them made money, perhaps with the exception of Elektra, almost none of that money went to Marvel itself. Having been under constant threat of bankruptcy since the comic book crash of the early 1990s, Marvel saw a quick way to stay afloat in selling the movie rights to its A-list properties to production companies that were under no obligation to maintain the artistic vision of, or share the profits with, the creators and publishers of the original storylines. So while it appeared that Bryan Singer's X-Men movies were revitalizing public interest in Marvel, the company itself was in dire straits. Now, what's particularly intriguing about what's going to happen next is that it would not have happened had Marvel been in control of its most famous characters. If Marvel had continued to own the rights for Spider-Man and the X-Men and the Fantastic Four, then the movies would likely have continued along the same well-established path as DC had done with their characters, releasing individual films like Batman and Superman. Marvel would have had no need to experiment or try something new because it could have continued to churn out copy after copy as Sony did with Tobey Maguire Spider-Man and the rebooted Andrew Garfield Spider-Man. But for Marvel, who were left with only their B-list characters at best, there was a need to try something innovative. The idea of a shared comic book universe is not anything new. Superman and Batman have palled around for almost 80 years, and the Amazing Spider-Man issue #1 is a crossover with the Fantastic Four. In fact, Hugh Jackman's Wolverine narrowly missed a cameo appearance in Sam Raimi's Spider-Man due to their inability to locate appropriate clothing. But what this meant was that despite the eruption of superhero films available on screen, none of them had ever managed to do what comics had been doing from the very beginning. Something that Endeavor talent agent David Meisel was about to change. In 2003, Meisel suggested the creation of Marvel's own movie studio, one that controlled the financial and artistic future of the properties still under its control. And 2 years later, Marvel, who were once again in financial difficulty, went to financier Merrill Lynch with a plan. If the bank would loan them $525 million, then Marvel promised to deliver something different to what movie audiences had seen before. Instead of releasing individual films that had no bearing upon one another, Marvel Studios aimed to create a living, breathing world where characters from one movie would interact with characters from another just as they did in the comics themselves. There would be subtle nods to fans of the franchise, and maybe the events of one story could impact the events of another. To guarantee the bank's original investment, Marvel would even put up the rights to almost everything they still owned as collateral. Captain America, the Avengers, Nick Fury, Black Panther, Ant-Man, Cloak and Dagger, Doctor Strange, Hawkeye, Power Pack, even Shang-Chi, Master of Kung Fu were all put on the line should the experiment fail. Merrill Lynch agreed to the financing deal, and Marvel Studios was formed, with Paramount responsible for marketing and distribution. Now, for all the MCU fans amongst you, you might have noticed that there's a rather important character missing from that list. The universe's debut film, and frankly the poster boy for the entire experiment. The character of Iron Man was still owned by New Line Cinema at the time the Merrill Lynch deal was struck, but just 2 months later, their option ran out and the rights returned to Marvel. Unfortunately, because the character had not been part of the original deal struck with Merrill Lynch, Marvel Studios was unable to use their acquired financing on the property, forcing them to do something that would have been unimaginable just years before. they funded the entire first movie themselves. While today we accept the Marvel Cinematic Universe as a titan of the Hollywood system, it's worth reminding ourselves that its origins really do come from independent filmmaking. One of the reasons the movies have been so successful and the stories they tell have had such an impact is that the very studio itself was on the line should anything go wrong. There was no margin for error in the first few years of the MCU, and while corporations like Fox and Sony could afford to make a dud here and there, such a thing would have been disastrous for a comic book publisher that's trying to desperately just to stay afloat. I often say that in his search for the great American novel, Stan Lee wrote it inadvertently. The tales of the Fantastic Four showcase the nuclear family that every American dreams of having, even if they bicker now and again. The struggle of the X-Men against oppression represents America's inherent belief that all men are created equal and that sometimes you must fight to defend that belief. And Spider-Man is every teenager just trying to make their way in a world that seems designed to hold them back. He's on a search for purpose, burdened with the knowledge that you must do what you know to be right, even if it's not what you really want. The Marvel Universe and the superhero genre itself are reflections of our hopes and dreams, our desires, our fears. They're our strengths and also the very flaws that make us human to begin with. Since its very inception, the superhero genre has been referred to as childish, and despite its vast popularity, there seems to be little that is being done to change that perception. These characters with their fantastic abilities are just seen as a way of granting teenage boys the power fantasies they're unable to enjoy in their everyday life. But what these critics fail to take into account is the vast number of influences that impact upon the superhero. Crime, romance, drama, comedy, science fiction and fantasy do not face the same judgment, and yet, from the very beginning, all of these were included in the great mixing bowl that made up the superhero. You couldn't combine Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde with The Great Gatsby and Lord of the Rings and expect them to plausibly coexist. Yet when the Hulk, Iron Man and the God of Thunder Thor argue and laugh and fight side by side, we accept it because the genre encourages you to engage with your imagination in ways that we respect in children and that we discourage in adults. And while the superheroes themselves may be restrained within conventions created in the late 1930s, the stories they interact with are limited only by the amount of imagination that you are willing to bring to the table. And as the great Terry Pratchett once said, stories of imagination tend to upset those without one. In episode 1 of the show, we will jump straight into evaluating the Da Vinci of our times himself, Tony Stark, with 2008's Iron Man. Critiquing the movie's plot, its politics, and the outrageously charismatic performance of Robert Downey Jr., we will assess how Marvel Studios did with their first feature film, and whether or not it's worthy of the franchise built on its